Monica McWilliams is a long-time campaigner and advocate for justice. Monica and Joan McKiernan's research in 1994 formed the basis of the Tackling Domestic Violence policies and brought about interagency working. Monica's been a good friend to Foyle Women's Aid and a strong supporter of their work to eliminate violence against women. She's a significant figure in Northern Ireland in a variety of roles, among others, Oversight Commissioner for Prison Reform in Northern Ireland, Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, there's an awful lot of commissions here, and is currently on the Government Advisory Panel on the disbandment of paramilitary organisations. Ladies and gentlemen, Monica McWilliams.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute delight and privilege to be here today. I am one of those who was around 40 years ago, and I'm delighted to be back in this city today to pay tribute to the wonderful women who started off Women's Aid here in this city. I don't know if Hilary Sidwell is here. I know that you've heard from Avla Kilmurray, and I particularly want to pay tribute to a good friend of mine, now deceased, Cathy Harkin. Cathy coined the phrase, "We are living in an armed patriarchy." And this city, more than any city, understood that 40 years ago. Not only were women being abused by their partners and by men known to them, but they were also being abused by men not known to them. There were certainly too many guns around, and hence the word armed, along with the word patriarchy. I remember the courage of the women in this city when they also had to take on the faith communities in the notion that we lived also in an ecumenical patriarchy. The attitudes in those days were that this organisation was splitting up families. And it was those brave women who had to ask, and at what cost are you keeping the family together? So we have come a long, long way. And it's to the resilience and the courage and the coping strategies of the victims and survivors and the staff and the workers of Women's Aid that we're here today, 40 years later, to pay tribute. Because so much has changed, and yet so much still has to change. So many of those attitudes have changed, yes, through education, yes, through public awareness, yes, through training. But as I often said at the peace talks, not all arms are imported. So although we have maybe taken many of those guns and illegal weapons, and indeed some of the legal weapons that were used, because we did have the highest homicide rate here in Northern Ireland for many, many years, compared to Yorkshire or Devon and Cornwall or the Republic, where I made the comparisons. But it's not just the weapons that had to be taken out of people's hands, because often, as we used to say, the tongue can cause a lot of damage as much sometimes as the gun. And when women told me it was what was said to them that often remained with them long after the injuries healed. So the psychological damage, the physical injuries that I recorded in 1992, all of the financial damage in terms of leaving women in debt, we had to bring in to policy and legislation. Because too much of the focus was on physical violence, and yet we know that coercive control and coercive abuse comes in all shapes and forms. And so today again, we're here to commend the action and the strategy that has been put in to change the definition, to focus on the issue of control, to focus on the issue of power, to focus on the issue of coercion. So again, I think that in terms of policy and legislation, it's really important that that strategy understands domestic violence. And I would say, Judge, that it is good that we understand the intergenerational transmission, but that's not the only cause. And indeed, too much in Northern Ireland, we focused on alcohol. And yet again, in my study, I kept asking, was this person also abusive to you when he was sober? And again and again and again, it was the case. Of course, alcohol exaggerates it. Coarse alcohol extends the injuries and the damage. But this person's attitudes when sober and this person's behaviour when sober should have also been taken into account. And it isn't always the case that it's passed on from generation to generation. Many young men, and they're in this room, would have observed abusive relationships in their own home and went on not to repeat that behaviour. So those are the kinds of messages that we need to send out, that this can be stopped, this can be changed. And 40 years later, it's an unfinished business. So bringing it out in the open in 1992, the research began then, it was published in 1994, and then followed by another study on taking domestic violence seriously, issues for the civil and criminal justice system. And I'm very pleased to say that, unlike quite a few of my colleagues in the university, I lived through every single one of those recommendations being implemented. And it was a partnership between the Health Service and what was then the Northern Ireland Office responsible for justice and policing. And so we sat with the individuals responsible, the public decision makers, the civil servants, to see through every single one of the recommendations. I had 13. I thought it was an unlucky number at the time, but I'm very pleased to say all 13 were eventually brought forward and implemented. Now, as you can imagine, back then the focus was on political terrorism. And the idea that terrorism could be domestic and inside people's own homes really came to the fore as a result of the testimonies that I collected in that report, because it was terror, that the person in the position of being assaulted, seriously wounded, and indeed listening to families of individuals who had been murdered, that is terror. And today in Northern Ireland, we still don't have homicide reviews, despite the legislation having introduced those over 20 years ago. So we have to ask, why are we falling back on some of these issues when, in the 90s, we in Northern Ireland were ahead? Indeed, in legislative terms, we were ahead. Despite the first piece of legislation being introduced in 1970s, I remember parliamentarians standing up and saying that they would permit the legislation to cover husbands and wives, but not for cohabitees, because if they chose to live in sin, they could reap the consequences. So that was the attitudes that were around when that first legislation was introduced. But as we've gone on to amend the legislation, it was really important, as I said, that we focused on where the power and control was coming from. So attitudes had to change in order to change policies, in order to change legislation, and partnerships were created between justice and health, but also with education. And as Judge McWilliams has just said, it is those partnerships today that have made Foyle's Women's Aid so strong. It was Foyle Women's Aid that pushed those partnerships, along with the other refuge providers throughout Northern Ireland and Women's Aid elsewhere. I've just now gone back to repeat that study of 1992, over 25 years later, asking what difference does peace make? Because obviously back then we were in the height of a conflict. I haven't finished the study, I'm currently doing it, and I want to thank Foyle Women's Aid and all the other refuge providers for allowing me to go back now and once again take testimony from over 100 women, and from police officers, and from social workers and doctors, and the judiciary, probation, the court service. Some of the findings would say that we have indeed changed, and it is good to see how much provision has been made over those years by probation, in particular in tackling the attitudes of men and trying to put in really useful programs that have good outcomes. But they can't do that without resources. And it still saddens me to hear that programs have had to be stopped or they couldn't be continued, despite the fact that they know what works. And I am very heartened to hear about One Safe Place, because too often I had to interview victims who had to go from A to B to C to D, repeating their stories over and over again. And so many times did we say we need a one-stop shop, we need one place where all of the providers could centre their work around the victim, rather than having the victim having to go through this horrendous journey. And anyone who has interviewed or any person who has taken evidence will know that each time you have to listen to that, how much worse it must be for the person telling the story. So one safe place is so important. But what I'm now finding in the study, and I can't reveal all the findings as yet, is that there has been a rise in sexual violence. Now I have to ask myself, 40 years ago and 20 years ago, did we not have the language? Could we not name it? Could women not talk about it in a way that they can today? But it is quite horrendous. They argue that if sexual violence is present in a coercive relationship, it heightens the risk. But what I'm finding is that practically every respondent has told me there is sexual violence. So again, I would advocate that we shouldn't just focus on those you think are high risk, because someone who's experiencing this are all potentially at very high risk. And I'm certain that Foyle's Women's Aid are very aware of that. The other changes that I'm noticing, of course you would notice this after 25 years, is what we would have thought would have been a useful intervention of the technology of the internet has turned out to be yet another abusive weapon, and that women can be stalked and tracked. And although there's legislation now slowly being introduced against the more abusive elements of this technology, it does concern me greatly, and particularly the access to pornography. So there's much work still to be done and much awareness in terms of all the times new and different types of coercive control is being found here in Northern Ireland. But most of all, what I'm finding is the inconsistency in some of the professional practice. Over and over again here in this city, I was hearing about some fantastic work, some really good practice, some excellent examples of work that should be replicated elsewhere. And then I would go further and find that it wasn't happening elsewhere, that it was inconsistent. So we have to ask, are we going backwards or forwards on the training? And that comes back to a question of resources. I would suggest to the Minister of Justice and to the Minister of Health, who are both women, that this is your time, that in the next 4 years, come together, work in partnership, see what has made the difference, know what works, and try and spread that across the whole of Northern Ireland, so that a woman doesn't say to me when I'm interviewing her, well, it all depended on who you got. So again, there are still big gaps and big holes in some of our responses. And again, Women's Aid here in Foyle and elsewhere have raised that issue. I'm delighted, Judge, that there are more women, at least 2 more now, in the High Court. Had to wait 50 years for that to happen. I would say that those women were probably around a long time ago, but at least Northern Ireland can start to hold its head up, and that we don't say any longer that we never had a single woman in the High Court. But we need more, and we do need more judges like yourself. There is no question in my mind about that. And again, I do think the judiciary should open up to training, should open up the Judicial Studies Board to having individuals come in and explain, as you rightly said in your example just now, of what the difference can make in terms of the woman who told you her story about a non-molestation order and how you practically had to work around that. And that's why we need different bodies coming together. Years ago, 40 years ago, Women's Aid would not have been seen as the experts on this issue. Today, Women's Aid and Foyle's Women's Aid in particular, are the experts on this issue. I come 24 hours ago, I was in Colombia, just yesterday. And I was working with an organisation called 1 Million Women for Peace. I was in Cartagena, where they signed the peace agreement after a 53-year war between FARC and government. I've been many times there, so it was really a wonderful moment to see that 43 million people who live in Colombia can now, in the next few days, on next Monday actually, they will go like we did to a referendum to say, sí, pour la paz, Yes, for peace. And they too, like us, are in this moment where they weren't sure what peace would mean. And I think it is good that we live in a relatively peaceful society now. You have just heard that I have been, in the last 6 months, responsible with 2 others. First woman to be appointed to such a panel in Northern Ireland, ever since the peace agreement, to look at the disbandment of paramilitaries. And again, I would have to say that all these years later, there is still too much of an impact in different areas and here in this city of the way that paramilitaries are still working. And I know Mari has raised her voice courageously down through the years on that issue. But that's for another day in terms of what I found, and the report is there and it's published. And like Colombia, they're now asking themselves the same questions. How can we give resources to those who were so terribly harmed by the conflict? And now, finally, they're beginning to able to raise the issue. I was with 700 of their 184 police officers on Friday last, and we'll be going back again next month to start work with them on this issue of how do you divert resources now into violence against women that may not be associated with the armed conflict, much of which still is in Colombia. But can you believe that they're only now able to look at domestic violence? That they had so much sexual violence and so many horrendous human rights violations that when I used to visit their refuges and ask what they were doing for victims of domestic violence, they said, we can't open our doors. We haven't got the resources. So in a country like Northern Ireland, we have the resources. And women are coming into refuges, and they have now support outside. And so we should be putting those resources in what I believe is one of the priorities for a civilised country, which is the human rights of allowing people to live in dignity. So my final words would be that it is good now that this issue has become a human rights issue, and that I want to pay tribute to Women's Aid for having taken this so far. I got soaked on my way in here today. 24 hours ago, I was soaked from perspiration where it was nearly 36 degrees. And I thought, I can't wait to get back to a good soaking in Northern Ireland from rain. But I think I suddenly changed my mind. But as they say, after the clouds comes the sun. And today is Foyle's Women's Aid's place in the sun. And I pay tribute to you for all that hard work, for staying with it, and for being there for women who are the victims and survivors of this terrible violence. I can, because I know it at first hand, truly say to you that you have given these women and many others, the beneficiaries today as they stand with you in acknowledging the work that you're doing, that they are truly the beneficiaries of human dignity. Thank you for all your work.